Hi everyone and welcome to the video presentation for module number 4. This is our introduction to what's called part writing. So in this video, we'll first define the term part writing, of course. Then we'll work on using the principles of counterpoint to complete short root position chord progressions in 3 and 4 voices. That sounds complicated, but it really isn't. It's just combining two things that we already know about into something new. We'll learn some details of this, such as when it's best to use what's called an incomplete chord. And we'll also define the term tendency tone and understand why it is important in the part writing that we're going to do. Okay, so part writing. Part writing, or what's also called voice leading, is simply composing the individual voices in a piece of music. Now that doesn't mean singing voices necessarily. So, in orchestra music, we still consider the individual lines in the music to be voices. So that's kind of the terminology here. What we're doing is actually more like vocal music. So in our 4-part vocal scores, what we called SATB, the parts we're going to compose are the soprano line, so the top line, right? And then the alto line, the tenor line, and then sometimes we'll also compose the bass parts. And notice I'm referring to each one as a line. So one of the things we have to do is think about these lines as they move from left to right. So this is a little bit like counterpoint. So just like counterpoint, the goal of part writing is to create parts that sound good together and sound good on their own. So let's talk about what makes things sound good together. And we already kind of know this from counterpoint, because in counterpoint, the intervals that happen when two notes happen at the same time had to be consonant. And it's the same with part writing. The parts you compose must harmonize with the other parts. And for now, what we're going to start with are harmonies that create a triad when they sound together. So if you look at this example, and I'll play it and then we'll look at it, everything here is a triad. So every time the notes move, right? Every time we have a new chord, which you can easily see in the music in the up and down way, we have a different chord, a different triad, in fact. So on this first chord here, we have an F, an A, a C, and an F. Well, that is an F major triad. In the second chord, we have a D, an A, another D, and an F. And if we put those in order, those would be D, F, A. So that second chord is a D minor triad. Here we have a G, a B flat, and a D in both the alto and the soprano. So whenever the stems face both directions, that means that both voices are singing that part there. So that's a G minor triad. And then the second to last chord here has a C, a G, a C, and an E. So that's a C, E, G triad. That's a C major triad. And finally, this ends with an F, A, C, F triad again. So another F major triad. So every time the voices move together, they create a new harmony. And most of the time, each beat will get a different triad. So each chord, each thing that happens when the voices move together at the same time, will have its own triad. And that triad, of course, is going to be voiced according to the principles we learned in the last unit. So either as closed voicing or an open voicing, and you won't have any more than an octave between the upper 3 parts, just like we learned about in the last unit. Okay, so that's how things sound good up and down as harmony. So let's see how these parts sound good individually. Why are they good melodic lines? Why are they good counterpoint? So the parts have to make sense on their own. So they sound good when they're sung with the other parts, but they also have to sound good or make sense on their own. So each one should sound as much like a melody as possible. So basically, each part must be a line of counterpoint. And let's kind of look at this individually. So we see that this soprano line goes F, F, D, E, F. Right? So we have a repeated note followed by a leap downward between F and D, which is followed by a step up in the upwards direction and then ends up by step. So it's mostly step. This alto line, same kind of thing. Okay. This tenor line. So they each have their own identity. The bass lines in this style are a little bit more jumpy. But if we put them all together, they create that chord progression. So the harmony comes from the way that these voices move together, but the lines themselves have their own melodic identity. Let's look at that a little bit more in detail. So they're melodies, and they also have relative motion, just like lines of counterpoint do. So if you look at the soprano line again, like we said, it's mostly stepwise, so that's a melodic part of it. When there is a leap, it's followed by a step in the opposite direction, just like we were doing with counterpoint. And if you compare it to the other voices that are happening, well, if you compare it to the bass line, which is probably the most important one, when you move from F to F against the F to D, we have oblique motion. Then when the soprano line moves down from F to D, that goes against the D to G in the bass, which is contrary motion. And the same thing happens when you have D to E in the soprano against G to C in the bass. Again, contrary motion. So these things, these lines, just like counterpoint, have relative motion. And it's important to remember that each line has relative motion against all the other lines. So that's an important consideration when you're writing these things. So you want to, we'll talk about the details of this, but you want to be aware that you have 4 lines of counterpoint happening simultaneously. And it creates relative motion between all of the different parts. Okay. So, luckily, since there are a lot fewer options when part writing, you only need to worry about a few of the most important rules like we did with counterpoint. So first of all, the best practice is that the parts should be mostly stepwise, just like good melodies in counterpoint should mostly move by step. If you do have leaps, they should either be a third, right? And then anything else can happen. But if they are bigger than a third, then they should be a singable interval. So like a perfect fourth, a fifth, sometimes a sixth, but that's pretty rare. But if it's a kind of a bigger leap like that, it should be followed by a step in the opposite direction, just like with counterpoint. And parts should not cross over each other. So you should never, this is a rule from last time too, you should never have an alto go above a soprano or a tenor go above an alto. That should not happen. They can share the same note like we saw in that previous example. So they can overlap, they just cannot cross each other. And parts, like I said before, should have as much contrary motion and oblique motion as possible. And that is relative to all the other parts that are happening. And then, of course, parallel unisons, fifths, octaves are not allowed in this style, just like they're not allowed in the counterpoint style. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. So in this example, we'll add a single alto part to complete the chord progression. So this is like an example in the homework you have to do tonight. So we have an incomplete chord progression. We're only given the top part, the soprano, and the bottom part, the bass. And we have to add the middle part, in this case an alto, to complete the chord progression. So a good thing to do is play it if you can. Listen to it and see if you can hear what's missing from it. So it's pretty empty because there's nothing filling in that middle part to this. Okay, so what do we really need to do here? Well, we need to make sure that all of these triads are complete. And we need to do that by adding a single voice. So to do that, we need to figure out what's missing from these triads and see if we can create a line that will fill in all of those gaps and still be melodic. So we're only writing a single line here. And let's look at what's missing from this first chord. So this is the key of D major, and we have a 1 chord. So the 1 chord in D major should be a D major triad. So it should have a D, an F sharp, and an A. But let's look at what's here. So we have a D and an A. So we're missing the F sharp. So the first note we should write is probably that F sharp. So let's add that to our alto line. And I'm picking that F because that's the only F that alto can sing. So we can't go below down here because that's out of the alto range, which is something we learned about last time. Okay, so that works. Now let's look at what's missing in the next chord. So this is a 4 chord in the key of D major, and that should be a G major chord. So that's G, B, and D. And let's look at what's here. We have a G and a B. So check, check. The thing we're missing is the note D. So how can we get that? Well, maybe we can have a small leap, because that's okay. A small leap down to the note D. So there you go. A small leap of a third is fine. But it should be mostly stepwise, so hopefully we can have a step after that little leap there. So let's look at this next chord. We have a 5 chord, and the 5 chord in D major is an A major triad, so it should have A, C sharp, and E. And right now we have an A in the bass, and we have an E in the soprano, so the note that we need to complete the chord is a C sharp. And the easiest way to get to that is to move down by step from our previous note and get the C sharp. So let's listen to how we did here. You can hear it sounds so much nicer than the empty kind of sound we had before. And if we look at that alto line, it's actually kind of nice to sing. Right? A nice melody. So we have 3 melodies now working together to create harmonies. So there you go. Now whenever you write it just in 3 voices, we call that simply a 3-part texture because we have 3 different parts. Okay, let's keep going here. So in this example, we'll add an alto and a tenor to complete this chord progression. And we'll use the same process, except now we have more voices to work with. So again, you want to play it, see what it sounds like, and see if you can hear what's missing from it. It's not too bad on its own, especially that middle chord, but there are some things that could be filled in. So we need to add the alto part and the tenor part. So the alto part is going to go on this staff here, and the tenor part will go on this staff here, as you know. And so let's see what's missing from each of these chords and see if we can write 2 melodies that complete the chords here. So in this first one, we're in the key of G major this time, and it's a 1 chord. So we should have a G major triad, which is G, B, and D. And the only note that we have is a G in the bass and a G in the alto, in the soprano. So we need to get a B and a D here. Okay. Well, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, but maybe we can do what's called a closed voicing to start with. So let's add a D in the alto. And closed voicing just means that the 3 voices are within an octave from each other. So there you go. So now we have a complete chord on the first beat. Well, let's see what happens when we have to move to the next chord. So this is a 5 chord, and 5 chord in the key of G should be D, F sharp, and A. And we have a D and an F sharp already. So the only note we need is the note A. Well, which note is closest, which one of the notes we already wrote is closest to the note A? Well, the closest one is the tenor, because that's on a B. So the best choice would be to move that tenor B down to an A. And that way we have contrary motion against the bass, which is always a good thing. We have parallel motion between the soprano and the tenor, but it's a 6th and a 6th, so that's not a problem. All right. And now what's missing from here? Well, whenever we're writing 4 voices, the best thing to do remember from last unit, is to double the root, and the root of this chord is D, and it just happens to be that our alto is on D, so the best thing to do would be to just repeat it. So there you go. That's the best voicing we can probably hope for. All right. Let's look at what's next. So we have a 6th chord in the key of G. So we have an E minor triad. So we'll have an E, a G, and a B. And we have E represented already. We need to find a home for a G and a B. Okay. We have some options. So let's start with the B. Which note is closest to B? Well, the tenor is, so what would happen if we went up to the B? Well, we cannot do that because that creates parallel motion with the bass and the tenor, okay, which is parallel fifths. So that is not something we want to do. But the A is also close to the G, so the best thing for our tenor to do is not move up to the B, but move down to the G. So that gives us our G. All right, and now our alto, in order to complete the chord, it will have to have a small little leap down to the note B. And that gives us all the notes that should be in that last triad. So let's see what this sounds like. Okay, and you can see we have nice motion, right? So we had oblique motion between voices here. We had contrary motion. All the voices are moving down while the bass moves up, which is a good thing. Because whenever you move in contrary motion, you automatically avoid parallel fifths and stuff like that. So that's why we do it. So there you go. So that is writing in 4 voices. So whenever we write 4 voices, we call that a 4-part texture. Okay. So let's talk about complete and incomplete chords, because since we're writing voices, sometimes it's not always possible to have every note of the triad. Ideally, each chord in our pieces will include every note of the triad because that makes it sound the most full. In a 4-voice texture, the root of the triad will also be doubled. So that's kind of the ideal situation. A triad should have a doubled root, and all of the parts of the triad should be present. So it should have a root, it should have a third, it should have a fifth, and that root should be doubled somewhere. That's the ideal that we want. So in this example, we were able to do that. So if you look at the chords here, that first chord's an F minor triad, it has all of its notes. The second chord's a B flat major triad that has all of its notes. And that last chord is a C minor triad, which has all of its notes of the triad, and all the roots are doubled as well. So there, we did great. We call these chords that have every single note of the triad, we call them complete chords because they're not missing any of their notes. But sometimes, to create good counterpoint in each part, it's not possible to include every note of the triad. And this is especially true when we're doing 3-voice writing, because with 3 voices, and we won't do too much of it, but with 3 voices, sometimes we won't have literally enough voices to cover every note in the triads. So sometimes we have to leave something out. So here's an example of that same chord progression, but with 3 voices. And you'll see that the first chord is complete. That's an F minor triad again, so it has F, A flat, C, that's good. And the second chord is complete. It has a B flat, an F, and a D, but that third chord is missing a note, right? It's supposed to be a C minor triad, but it only has a C, an E flat, and a C. And the reason that that had to happen is because there were already 2 C's in the outer voices, right? So when we were writing that inner voice, we could not go to the G because, well, we couldn't complete the chord because we could either pick between the G or the E flat, and either way, the chord would not be complete. So that last chord, since it doesn't contain every single note of the triad, it's called an incomplete chord, and it's perfectly okay. Because if you listen to it, it doesn't really sound incomplete. it still sounds like a C minor chord that just doesn't have all of its notes. So that's called an incomplete chord. So let's talk about how to use those. So the part of the triad that is the least important in defining the triad is the fifth. And the fifth of the triad can be left out if doing so results in better counterpoint, like we were talking about. So if you're going to leave out a note of the triad, the one to leave out is the fifth of the triad. You never want to leave out the root, and you never want to leave out the third. If you're going to leave something out, it should always be the fifth of the triad. So let's kind of complete this one here. So this is the key of C, and we want to have given us a start here. So we want to complete this with the best voice leading possible, and this is going to be in 4 voices. So in the key of C, we already have our A minor triad. We need to have a 5 chord on beat 2, and the 5 chord should have a G, a B, and a D. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my alto down to the note G, and I'm going to have a kind of a big leap of a fifth by moving my tenor down to the note B. All right. Now I want to complete this chord here, and to do that I need to figure out what I'm missing. So I have a C, or I need a C, I need an E, and I need a G. And I have 2 C's, so I need to find a home, hopefully for an E, and hopefully for a G. Well, I could get the G from the alto by doing this, but there's really no good way to get the E from my tenor, because I leapt down, so I should step in the opposite direction. So really, this B needs to go to the note C. But that's a problem because I've left out my third. So I have no third. So that's a problem. So I need to kind of fix that, and my only choice is to not go to the G in the alto, but go instead to the E in the alto. That's really the best way to handle this. Now you could smooth that out if you wanted to. You could change the alto to make this a little bit more melodic by leaping down another fifth to the D and then stepping up. So that would kind of work too. It's kind of a nice progression, and you have sort of a dramatic thing going on there in the tenor, and right, kind of nice melodic lines. So that's the best way to handle it. Now I had to leave out one note. I chose not to leave out the third because the third and the root define the chord, so I omitted the fifth to give me the best voice leading possible. Okay. All right. So you can also leave out the fifth because there are not enough voices left to make the triad complete. So this is what happens in 3 voices. So here, again, we want to fill out this chord progression, but we're only allowed to use 3 voices. Well, how will we do this? Well, let's look at what's missing from our first chord. It's a 6th chord in the key of B flat, and that chord will be a G flat minor triad. So we'll need G, B flat, and D. And we already have a G, so we need to find a home for both the B flat and the D. But we only have one note, and obviously that one part cannot sing both those notes. So we need to pick one of them, and the one we need to pick is the third, because the third is much more important than the fifth. So if we're going to leave a note out, we're going to leave out the fifth. So we'll write a B flat in our alto. Okay, let's look at our next chord. We have an F and an A, and this chord needs to be F, A, C, because it's the 5 chord of this key. So we got F, we got A, we need to find a home for C, and we can just give that to the alto by stepping up. All right, and then in our last voice, again, we have 2 of the same notes. We have a B flat, and we also need a D in that chord and an F in that chord. So again, we only have one note. We already got B flat in both those voices, so the one we need to have is the note D. So that's the best way to handle this situation. Okay. And again, we have parallel motion, but just like counterpoint, it's okay to have parallel sixths. The only things you don't want to have are parallel fifths. Okay, you can have parallel anything else, just not parallel fifths. So this is perfectly fine. Okay, one last thing we want to talk about are tendency tones. And a tendency tone is a note in a scale that has a pull towards another note in the scale. And the only one we really care about right now is the tendency tone scale degree number 7. So this is called the leading tone because it wants to move to the note above it, the tonic note. So in the key of D major, the leading tone is the note C sharp. So if I play some notes in the D major scale, and I get to that note, that's the 7th note of the scale, and if you listen to it, it really wants to pull you up to that note, right? That's why we call it a tendency tone, because it has a tendency to move to that next note, right? In solfege, in ear training, you call that T-do, and that's a really important relationship. Just like in part writing, it's one of the most important relationships that we have to deal with. And we'll talk about that in a second. The other tendency tone is scale degree 4, which we'll deal with later in the semester, and that's used when making 7th chords. We're not going to worry about it too much right now. The only thing we need to worry about right now is the tendency tone, the leading tone that leads to scale degree 1, the tonic note. In part writing, scale degree 7 needs to be handled with care because it has a tendency to want to move, so we have to let it. If the note is in the soprano or bass part, what we call an outer voice, it must move to the tonic in the next chord. If the note is in the alto or tenor, an inner voice, then we say it should move to the tonic in the next chord, but it does not necessarily have to. And there's some reasons for it not to do that. So in this example, we're back in the key of B flat, and you'll see that I'm missing the soprano, the last soprano note. So let's listen to this. So I'm left with that note in the soprano, and in the key of B flat, that is the 7th note of the scale, so that needs to move up to B flat in that last chord. So since that is a leading tone in an outer voice, it needs to resolve up to a B flat for this to be complete. If it did anything else, it would sound really weird, and we don't want weird stuff. Right? That's how that line has to go. Okay. In this chord progression, scale degree 7 is in an inner voice. In fact, it's in the tenor. So, like we said, it should move to the tonic note in the next chord. So let's see what would happen if we did that. So if we move that B natural up to the note C, then you'll see that we have a chord that has a C, another C, an E flat, and a C. Well, this should be a C minor triad, so this triad is not complete because it's missing its G. And that's okay. But if we did want it to be complete, which most of the time we do want things to be complete, we cannot go to that C. So in this case, it might be better, since that leading tone, that B natural, is in an inner voice, we can get away with not moving that up by steps. So we can, if we want this chord to be complete, which we usually do, we want that to move down to a G. And that would sound fine because we wouldn't notice the fact that that tendency tone did not resolve correctly. So it sounded fine. Another thing that can happen, especially in a minor key, is that the seventh scale degree can create another problem. And here, the leading tone, which is in an inner voice, moves to double the root in the next chord. Because if it did anything else, it would create an awkward problem. So the F sharp moves down to an E sharp, and this is the key of F sharp minor, so the leading tone is E sharp. So if we wanted this chord to be complete over here, if we wanted to double the root, we could move the alto down to the note D. So that would give us a complete chord with a doubled root. But this interval here is called an augmented second, which is one of those things that doesn't sound bad when you hear it, but it is really difficult to sing in context. Right? So that sounds really weird, doesn't it? So we avoid using that interval. So even though moving to, not resolving that by step would give us a complete chord with a doubled root, the best choice in this case is to actually let that resolve to the F sharp instead. And again, whenever you are using the same note in two voices, we just do a double stem kind of thing. So that just means that I have the F sharp in the soprano and the alto, and it sounds better. Okay. So let's summarize all this, and I've done a lot of examples, so I think just summarizing it will help. So ideally, each chord should be complete. And the only reason to not make a chord complete is that you can come up with a better counterpoint in the parts. And if you are going to do that, the note of the chord that should be left out is the fifth of the chord. In general, you want to use oblique motion, which will keep common tones between chords. So if two chords have notes in common, you want to try to repeat those in the voice, right? So if there is a note that you can keep in common when the alto moves from one chord to the next, then you want to keep it. If you can't, then you want to try to move by step. And you want to make sure that that step is in contrary or similar motion if you can. Tendency tones in the outer voices must resolve correctly, so leading tone must go to the tonic, but if it's an inner voice, it doesn't have to. Parallel unisons, octaves, and fifths should not exist between any of the voices. And that will pretty much get you through all situations. The book has a little bit of a different approach where it gives you techniques for what happens with different bass lines, and that's definitely a way to do it. But since you guys know the principles of counterpoint, I think it's a little bit easier just to kind of keep these four things in mind, and then, be sort of careful about checking for parallel fifths and stuff like that, making sure all the notes are in the chords, but leaving out the fifth if you have to, things like that. So I think it's just as easy to look at it this way, especially compared to all the different rules and techniques they give you in that chapter. So this is the way we're going to go with, but if going with the book helps you too, then that's good as well. All right, we'll do some examples in class, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.